It's a great honor and a privilege to have Thomas Smith with us here at the Fifth Direction. At least for me this morning, Thomas moving into his evening. But welcome.
I'm glad to be here, wherever here is between the two of us.
Exactly. So Thomas is a renowned poet, and I guess you could say a kind of stalwart of the Minnesota Men's Conference and men's work in general. And it's going to be terrific just to have a conversation with you, Thomas, about all these different things. But I'd like to start just to kind of orient ourselves. If you could maybe let people listening know kind of where you are in the world, maybe both physically, but also what's alive in your heart right now.
Well, that's a big one. Well, I'll start with the physical. I live in western Wisconsin, which is in the northern part of the Midwestern United States, quite close, in fact, to the Mississippi River. About a half hour's drive from Minneapolis and St. Paul, by the way, Minneapolis was where Robert Bly lived. So I'm kind of just sort of in the heart of the country. I live in a small college town near the edge of Wisconsin. It's called River Falls. And in fact, it does have a falls, which is literally across the street from our house. One of the branches of the river, the Kinnickinnick River, travels past that. And I think we who live in this town really understand the river to be part of our health. So the river is an important part of our lives, and I do a lot of my writing about the river or around the river. So that's where I am physically. It's also a renowned trout stream, so it's highly prized by trout fishermen, and very clean, a very clean river. We've taken care of it. So it's kind of our jewel. Where am I? What's close to my heart right now? Well, I'm 75 years old, and I've been writing poetry seriously since I was 30. I've published 10 books of poems and a few other kinds of books besides. I'm working on a couple of things. I'm working on a new poetry collection. I'm working on a very long-term memoir of my friendship and my learning from Robert Bly, because I was Robert's personal secretary since when was that? 1990. So I have a lot of journal entries about Robert Bly, which I'm trying to boil down into something that would make a coherent memoir. So those are a couple of the things that I'm close to right now.
It kind of leads me to the obvious question about how you came into poetry as a if we could call it a vocation, and how that kind of is maybe entangled with how you met Robert.
Sure. Well, I knew from my teens that I was on a writer's path. It was just one of those things, and I happened to get some good mentoring from a couple of older writers who encouraged me to think of myself as a writer when I was 13 or 14. So after that, there kind of really wasn't any doubt. It took me a while, though, to figure out what kind of writer I was, and that started to really coalesce when I turned 30. My youth was in that time of upheaval of the 60s, when we didn't trust the older men much, and we didn't really believe in the paths that they had set out for us. So, I was a hippie. I was one of those people that was wandering around for many years, actually. Finally, what happened was I bought a one-way ticket to Europe, and I just started roaming around Europe for about a year. And when I came back, I was 30 years old, and I began to seriously dedicate myself to poetry. So that's when that started to happen. And in a few years, I was starting to get poems accepted by journals. And let's see. So that was 78 that happened. And my first book of poems, Keeping the Star, came out in 1988. So that's how long it took me to build up a head of steam to really become a published poet.
Mm. Were you
So,
writing prior to through your 20s? I mean, were you
oh yeah,
things were
yeah,
happening, right?
yeah, fruitlessly and flailingly, but yes, I wrote steady, from my teens on. I never
Right.
stopped.
Mm.
I have,
Who are your influences in those kind of early years, kind of leading up to that, I guess, kind of pivotal trip away to Europe?
well, um, I didn't turn out to be the kind of writer that I thought I would by any means. Um, I really wanted to be a fantasy and science fiction writer, but I found out that I had not a gift for narrative particularly, but a gift for, capturing a moment. So my gift was much more suited to poetry than it was to fiction, but I didn't know that for a long time. So, Ray Bradbury was one of my early influences. The science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, you know
Sure,
him?
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually met Philip K. Dick when I was rambling around Europe. I was picking grapes in the Beaujolais, and I learned that there was a science fiction festival in Metz. And we had a few days off, so I hitchhiked up there, and Philip K. Dick was guest of honor. And I actually managed to get him to sit down with me and talk for about 20 minutes or so. It was at that point, it was one of the great experiences of my life.
Wow. Let me just interlude for a second there, because Metz as a compass point on the earth is actually a pivotal town in my life too.
Really,
Yeah, I had
really.
some experiences there in my early 20s, which really shaped who I am.
Mm.
Mm.
Hmm. Hmm.
Fascinating. Fascinating. So
Yeah, yeah.
Thomas, I thought you were going to mention kind of beat generation poets and things like that.
Um, yeah, I was exposed to them too, of course. And actually, before before I went to college, they were my main influence writing poetry. But poetry was kind of a sideline for me at that point, and I was trying to write fiction.
Mm, mm.
But yeah, yeah, I've got shelves of beat literature too. Yeah, I still enjoy them.
Oh, it's good stuff. I find myself drifting back there quite
Hmm.
often,
Hmm.
quite often.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
tell me, where did Robert Bly enter the picture?
Well, he entered the picture in 1969. Um, I was I was going attending the university right here, about 2 blocks away from where I sit at the moment, and a couple of our English professors were going to Minneapolis to hear a reading by poets against the Vietnam War. Several of us students wanted to go along, so we got to hear Bly, we got to hear Galway Cannell, Robert Creeley, Ed Sanders of the Fugs, which I admit at that time was the only one I'd heard of and was the real draw for me. I still love Ed Sanders, um, and a few others. So that's where Robert entered the picture for me, and he was at the height of his power at that point. Reading maybe not even reading, maybe just reciting The Teeth Mother Naked at Last. I remember he performed a piece by Mark Twain called The War Prayer as well. So all of a sudden, I was awake to Bly at that point. We actually got invited to a party afterwards at at a professor's house, and as is the case so often with these things, all of the poets who had been performing ended up standing around in the kitchen drinking and talking, and the rest of us were too intimidated to go in and pester them. So I think I ended up sitting under a table playing a guitar with a bunch of other younger students.
Wow.
So I didn't meet Robert until maybe 5 years later when he came to do a reading at our school, and then that was one of those crucial meetings.
Yeah, and I guess, extrapolating forward from there, you wind up, very deeply involved in the men's, I guess, men's movement and the Minnesota Men's Conference and all the rest of it. So I guess there was a time when you kind of joined the band in a sense, and was that next meeting kind of the pivotal moment for that to happen, or was there more to play out yet?
No, 74. That was still before the men's work took place, which was a few years later, at least, into the late 70s or early 80s. The the crucial piece of information that I got from Robert was we were sitting around once again after a reading, but this time I was talking to him. This is 1974, right here in this town where I live, and I think the English professors all wanted to talk about the new criticism or something like that, and Robert was completely bored with it, and we were sitting near each other, and he suddenly out of the blue asked me, "What's your sign?" And I said, "I'm a Capricorn." And he said, "Well, I am too." And he said, "It takes us a long time to find our direction." And for me at that time, I was about 26 years old, and I was somewhat adrift. And that was encouraging because it suggested to me that there was still time, and that it was in some ways kind of in a natural course of things, that I was just floating like that. And it was maybe 3 years later that I went to Europe, and then really kind of started to enter that chrysalis out of which the moth or the butterfly finally began to emerge.
Yeah.
So that was a crucial. If I had never gotten anything else from Robert, that would have been enough to make its imprint on me for the rest of my life.
Isn't it amazing? Just a couple of words here and there from someone of influence like that can make all the difference. But you talked earlier about the fact that come 1990 and you're his personal secretary. So I feel like there's a gap of a couple of decades there where you obviously really kind of built up a relationship, a strong friendship.
Yes, you're right about that. And that's part of what I've been writing about this last couple of years. Yeah, it took a long time, but I started to become a familiar, figure to him. I would go to all of his readings, and I was very engaged with his work. And let's see, let me just think here for a second. I went to work for him in 1990, and the precipitating cause of that was the volume of correspondence that was coming in after Iron John was published. He'd often, just hired, his kids to help him with, some of the typing, but at that point it was, it was on a whole different level. And I just luckily was available. So, that wouldn't have always been true either. So that was another place where the fates really stepped in and helped me out decisively.
Mm. Was it interesting to see the kinds of correspondence that was coming in as a kind of reaction or a response to Iron John? I'm sure you would have seen the full gamut.
Oh, sure. It was all interesting to me.
Mm.
I mean, my time with Robert was just a priceless literary education.
Mm. Mm.
I mean, more than the content of his work, which was also tremendously interesting and important to me, but just how he conducted himself as a literary person. I mean, I was taking notes all along the line, and I use those things I've learned from him all the time.
Mm. Yeah.
It was kind of like a very small school that I went to.
Well, and the interesting thing is that, I feel the same way. I never had the opportunity to meet the man. I'm on the other side of the world, and yet, he's had an utterly profound influence on my life. Mm.
Yeah, that's right.
I guess one of the things that's coming up for me listening to you now is and I've heard others speak to this, but I'd be really interested in your perspective. Is how was Robert surprised about the popularity of Iron John and kind of what it the ripples and everything that had sort of occurred from that point, or how was it for him on the release of that?
I don't know if it was a surprise. I think I think there had been a momentum building for several years, and his public profile was rising and rising and rising. Maybe he must have been surprised by it being a bestseller, but he didn't. I don't ever remember him saying that. I think it was more, okay, this is what's happening. I'm equal to it. I can handle it, and he could handle it.
Mm.
If it had happened to somebody else, it might not have gone as well.
Yeah, I mean, from there was such a groundswell, and the conferences began, and the whole idea of kind of what many refer to as kind of the mythopoetic men's movement started, and the entrance of James Hillman and Michael Mead and others. So I guess you were kind of completely caught up in that kind of maelstrom.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. And I guess the other thing is, this had been building up for, at least half a decade. So I do remember that we had a little mythopoetic men's magazine that we were publishing in the Twin Cities. I don't know if you've ever run into it. It's called Inroads.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I do remember us having discussions about whether or not the impending exposure was going to be a good thing or not for us. I think we were a little bit worried that it wouldn't be. Somehow that I don't know, that the vessel or the container would get leaky and that we lose some of our mojo with that.
And how do you feel now looking back?
Well, I think those fears were borne out to some extent. And once again, in this crazy country that I live in, the polarization around that was just incredible. I mean, there's a whole book of of women responding to the men's movement that I swear to you, I couldn't find any evidence that any of the contributors read Iron John the whole way through. And Sharon Dubiago, the poet, made these, extravagant attacks against Robert that were completely unjustified. He was accused of being a warmonger, and she called him our Gulf War poet. Nobody I know of in poetry in this country was more active in opposing our wars than Robert was. So it was very unfair. But I don't know. I mean, I guess that's the nature of this universe that we're in. Strong positions generate opposition, and then suddenly you've got two forces that are extreme. I don't know that what we were doing was extreme, but it was it was definitely not understood for what it was.
But also, as you say, the other side of that particular coin is just, the amount of men, over the decades that have been helped so tremendously, which has in turn, helped with their families, their partners, their loved ones, the community, etc. And I know even now, so many decades later, men that have gone as far as to say as they may not even be on the planet if they didn't come across that work. Yeah, myself included to some degree. Like, I remember coming across Iron John. I was in a pretty dark place. And it wasn't ultimately curative, but it gave me something to hang on to and something to explore and a thread to follow.
Well, I think all of us who participated owe a debt to that work that was done. I often think that at the time of my own father's death, we had reached a certain level of friendliness toward each other that I don't think would have been possible if I hadn't done some of that work, because we had a combative relationship. And it was through Robert's work, primarily, that I began to see it as important to try to improve that relationship, by putting some of my own ego stuff aside and trying to understand his life. I think that's what happened in my case anyway. It worked. It took. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that, and thank you for sharing that. Also, I wonder how the addition of some of these other men, some of these other teachers like James Hillman and Michael Mead, and how was that for you personally when you started to see the kind of sphere of influence kind of broaden far beyond Robert, and Robert kind of putting his arm around these others and bringing them in so beautifully as he did?
Well, that was part of Robert's genius. I always said that Robert had a genius for community, and he did. At least, in my life and in my circle of friendships and acquaintances, I know many, 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 many dear friends that I don't think I would have met if it hadn't been for us coming together over some facet of Robert's work. And just as he moved through this world, he met these extraordinary teachers and brought them in. And in its heyday, I would say that that work was like a fabulous feast. Going to one of the conferences, there were so many brilliant presenters and teachers. Well, we got spoiled because it was a highly unusual situation. I don't know that there's anything quite like that right now. What do you think?
No, I think they're facsimiles, but they're certainly nowhere near, nothing like it. And thankfully enough, we have so much of that archived. You know, there's so much
Yeah.
opportunity to go back and listen. And you know, I find myself doing that again and again, and I know so many other men that do. You know, and also I had the opportunity, you know, which is a beautiful thing, to a little blessing from COVID, but to join the Minnesota men's conferences when they went online for a couple of
Oh,
years.
yeah,
So
sure.
yeah,
Yeah,
so.
absolutely.
Yeah, so in fact, that was the
Mhm.
first time I had the opportunity to listen to you speak and be in your presence, was, you know, on a grid full of men on a Zoom screen.
Yeah,
Mm,
I remember that. I remember that.
mm. So I guess what I'm saying is it's still it's still there. It's still accessible. It's still
Yeah.
going, and and to me the beauty is still very present.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that there are any newer teachers of that kind of work that are showing promise out there? Because I can't tell. Um,
Look, I definitely, it's different. You know, I think there are a
yeah,
few, but I don't think
yeah, yeah.
you're never going to be able to duplicate what was happening back then. I'm not sure you
Right.
can
I'm
find
sure
another.
not. Yeah.
Yeah,
hmm
I don't think you can
hmm
find another Hillman, another
hmm
Malidoma Sommet,
hmm
another
hmm
Martine Practel. I mean, they all had their unique
hmm
geniuses, which I think it's impossible to
hmm
replicate.
hmm
So
hmm
yes, I think there's some
Yeah.
really interesting teachers out there at the moment, but they're different. You know, it's you know, Jung talked about the spirit of the depths and the spirit of the times, and it's the intermingling of those two things which makes the person,
hmm
right? Well, the spirit of the times is very different now.
hmm hmm Yeah. Completely. Completely.
Hmm. So So Thomas, I know you've been you've had some books, you know, recently birthed into the world. You said you've been pretty prolific of late. I mean, for me, just as a kind of maybe a backdrop for others listening, you know,
hmm
the way I see your poetry, it's and I know this is kind of confirmed by what I've read about you too, that it's very kind of nature based, and particularly around the area where you live. And you talked so beautifully earlier about the river nearby. In fact, I think you've even there's a title of a book which contains the name of that river. You've written about it specifically, if I can
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
correctly.
It's a chat book. It's a shorter book, maybe a couple of dozen poems, but yeah.
Mm.
Kinnick,
So
Kinnick.
yeah, that's it. And so
Hmm
so I guess is that a fair representation of your work? To me, there's a bit of well, there's a lot in there that I feel, you know, there's a bit of I feel a bit of William Stafford in there when I think about that kind of work. But
hmm
is that kind of representation of you? Do you feel that fits personally?
I think I've kind of been stably based in not, I wouldn't call it an experimental style. Experimental styles are very popular now, especially in academia. My influences, are really the generation born in the 1920s. As you start in on learning how to say what you most urgently need to say, the reason that which is the very reason that you admire and imitate an older poet, you gradually realize there are parts of your personality that are getting left out of your work. So Robert has this great translation of Rilke: I live my life in growing orbits that move out over the things of this world. I think if a poet is really growing, that's what they're doing. So I'm trying to let my poetry right now be as strange as I am. Um, and how strange that is, according to the rest of the world, is kind of moot. I just know that there are areas in myself that I haven't quite let into the poetry yet. So
Mm, mm,
but to answer your question, yeah, nature is important. Love is important. uh, Spirituality is important. So I think that my work generally tends to revolve around that cluster of concerns. Um, but I try not to be dull, and I try not to be boring. that's the one thing that I absolutely do not want to be in this world. I do not want to be dull or boring. So that's my struggle.
Well, expressing that strangeness of late, perhaps will never make you dull and boring.
Yeah.
For me, I hear that, Thomas, as an element of elderhood, which you've really earned, but that kind of strangeness, that I guess the word weird comes to mind, which Michael Mead likes to use a lot. I feel that's
Mhm.
that's earned. And you're allowed to do that now.
Yeah, a big change, came a few years ago. Without going into it too much, right around Christmas 2019, my wife Krista had a serious stroke, and around the same 24 hours, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Whammo. So she was in hospital and rehab for 3 months. Meantime, I was kind of dealing with my situation, and we're both doing really well right now. And then about 3 months later, COVID comes along, and there was that was a certain kind of crucible for me. It definitely tested my my strength as a person, and as a man, and as a lover too. I have a poem in in my most recent book of poems called "You Don't Know What Love Is." It's the title of an old song, but in a certain way, my love had never been tested like it was at that time. That was that that winter was a real crucible for me, and I think it also caused me to be a little bit more honest with myself about who I am, and what I wanted, and I feel like a different person, actually, since all of that happened.
Wow,
And
thank you.
as far as I'm concerned, it's an improvement.
Hopefully it's always an improvement, but yeah, what a crucible that was. Thank you for sharing that. I'm feeling drawn to ask you if you wouldn't mind maybe even reciting that poem for us. Obviously,
Well,
that's an ask. You're welcome
to have it right here. It's in a book called Medicine Year. Medicine Year. And this is kind of an audacious book because it was all written in 2020, and usually it takes me about 4 or 5 years to write a book of poems. And I thought, am I really actually writing an entire book of poems this year? And by the time it got into the fall, I realized, yes, this is really happening. So it may be the only time I ever do this. I hope it is. But this is called "You Don't Know What Love Is." And it's from rehab on New Year's Eve. So this is what I was doing New Year's Eve 2019. You can only watch, encourage, as she slowly lifts each forkful of mashed potatoes, chicken, and carrots to her mouth. She is deliberate, slow in her wheelchair perched higher than you, tired and undemonstrative after the rigors of the day's therapy. She speaks only with her eyes. Those eyes send you back to all that wishful talk in your teens and 20s about love, to which you pretended knowledge. Kid, you want to know what love looks like? The present moment asks that far back would-be Romeo. Don't take your eyes off the woman in the wheelchair, lifting with such care and effort her mashed potatoes. So you know what love is. That's what it said to me. So
wow,
that's a very early poem in the book. So it gets better. It's not a grim or depressing book, I don't think, but that's kind of how it felt.
Wow, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for asking.
You can feel the honesty and the moment like just coming through.
Yeah.
It's wow. And
Yeah.
everyone, we're all, as you're saying, things are on a more even keel now in the terms of how you guys are doing. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, we've been very lucky. We've had some good doctors and some good healers. You know, one of the things that I did as a change was during that period I began a qigong practice, and I haven't missed a day since St. Patrick's Day 2020. I'm very dedicated to it, and I really believe it's helped my healing a lot, and hers too. We do it together.
That's beautiful when you bring in a kind of a movement discipline like that, particularly together. There's strong medicine in that, isn't there?
Yeah, very much, very much.
And so I'm guessing that both those books that came out last year are strongly informed by what you went through over the past couple of years. Not just medicine year, but the other as well.
Oh, not so much.
Okay.
I'll just talk a little bit about this too.
Please do.
It's called Poetry on the Side of Nature, and the subtitle is Writing the Nature Poem as an Act of Survival. This is actually something that I started. Well, it's based on some teaching that I've done over the years. I've taught classes in nature poetry, but I realized at some point that I was starting to develop my own theory about what the Western nature poem is. I'm not equipped to speak about worldwide nature poetry, and I know that it exists everywhere. But I come out of the English poetry tradition, and that includes the English Romantics and the American Transcendentalists. And I had developed some thoughts about the nature poem as a response to the felt distance of Western people since the first industrial revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. At some point, my students were saying, you should write something about this, get it out there in the world. And I thought about that, and I thought, yeah, that's a book that I could do. And I started to seriously work on it in summer of 2016, when it appeared kind of horrifyingly clear that it was possible that that Trump was a credible contender for the U.S. presidency. And by the time I finished the first draft of the book, Trump was president, and I've just felt that the floodgates were open, and some of the safeguards were already being pulled down, and that the threat to the environment was intensifying. So I really wanted to get this book out. It was originally supposed to come out in spring of 2020. But then COVID hit, and the publisher said, no, I don't think we can do it this year. How about next year? And I said, well, okay. But then it didn't happen the next year, and it dragged on, and finally the publisher went down. I wasn't privy to the reasons, but so as of February last year, 2022, I was without a publisher, and I was strongly thinking about publishing it myself, but luckily, a Minnesota press called Red Dragonfly Press picked it up, and we got it out right away. So, yeah, I'm right now doing launch readings for it.
Oh wow, that's
So,
cool.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah. It was, it was there. There was a long, long road to this book being a reality.
Well, I think the timeliness has only kind of grown greater, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true.
yeah.
I wish it wasn't, but there you have it.
Mm. So maybe there was a reason, some kind of mystery workings behind the scenes there, which was kind of holding it off.
Yeah, I don't know. I used to wake up in the middle of the night and think, God damn it.
Yeah,
Is this thing ever going to get out?
yeah.
And then I try to, lull myself back to sleep and say, I'll think about that in the morning when I get up.
Mm. Mm.
But yeah.
And so I imagine there's more writings underway, and there's a book, the next one coming, or maybe the next couple, as you were saying. You tend to often be working on more than one at once these days.
Yeah, I think hmm, my best guess is that there'll be another book of poems coming along pretty soon, maybe
Mm.
like next year.
Mm.
I,
Mm.
I think it's even done right now. I was starting something before all of the disasters, and then I junked that and put out this book Medicine Year, but I still had at least half a good book from before that, and now I have at least half a good book from after that. So I'm putting them together, and um, I'm hopeful.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, I look forward to see what comes through. You know, I spent a little bit of the morning knowing obviously that I was going to be chatting to you. And I was reading parts of Waking Before Dawn. And
Oh yeah,
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 and so, you
yeah,
know, kind of all the way back to kind of 2006, 2007.
yeah.
And I actually got
Mhm.
a particular poem caught my attention. It was actually Trust. Um,
Trust.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
wondering kind of when I call that poem in, what comes up for you?
Well, it's it's my greatest hit.
Oh, well, there
It's
you
been
go.
reprinted to a fare thee well.
Mm.
I could read it for you, but I have to run upstairs to get the book. Is that something you'd like me to do? Trust. It's like so many other things in life, to which you must say no or yes. So you take your car to the new mechanic. Sometimes the best thing to do is trust. The package left with the disreputable looking clerk, the check gulped by the night deposit, the envelope passed by dozens of strangers, all show up at their intended destinations. The theft that could have happened doesn't. Wind finally gets where it was going through the snowy trees, and the river, even when frozen, arrives at the right place. And sometimes you sense how faithfully your life is delivered, even though you can't read the address.
Thank you. There's so much in there for me. Uh,
Thanks.
I, I
Thanks.
I love the line about wind finally getting to where it's going
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah. I,
Mm.
I think there's probably a little bit of Robert Bly in that line.
It does, and
I think there might be a little bit of William Stafford in that poem too, in
I
general.
mentioned earlier, I definitely see a bit of William Stafford through threaded through your work, which is he's up there in my estimations. I find myself reading a lot of William's work, so yeah, it would be an honor to be up there with the esteemed ones like Robert and William.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mm, mm.
Yeah,
So,
when I was younger, well, let's say when I was in my 20s and 30s, I could not hear William Stafford. I was attuned to the intense, fiery register of Robert Bly, and Stafford's tune I could not catch. So that was
mm,
something for me that came with maturity.
mm. Was there a moment, or was it more of a kind of process of feeling into it?
I don't know. I don't think there was a moment. I think I just kind of suddenly, I don't know. I was just suddenly able to approach his work with a more mature mind and I suppose a less adolescent need for excitement.
Yeah.
I had that big time for a long while.
Wow, there's this line that Robert says to William in that beautiful documentary, A Literary Friendship, and he talks about the difference between their two styles, and I wish I could remember it. It's something like I'm going to butcher it, but it's about Stafford's whispering to those that are awake and Bly yelling at those who are asleep or something like that.
Oh, that's good. I don't remember that, but that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's not quite right. So, but it's in that.
Good enough.
Yeah,
it's good enough.
It's in the ballpark. Yeah. So and I guess having the reinforcement of people like Robert, and Robert was, he spoke very highly about your work, and I've read some quotes, and that must have been I mean that must have been a beautiful thing to get such high praise, or almost a blessing from someone that you looked up to like that.
Oh yeah. You're absolutely right.
I've got a little line.
Kept me going for a long time.
Yeah, I've got a little line here actually, which I can repeat, where he said he described you as a high-spirited poetry horse riding over the hills of emotion.
Yeah.
Do you remember that one?
Oh yeah, sure. That's on the back cover of Waking Before Dawn. So yes, I've used it many times.
Yeah.
I've used it many times.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing, and others too. I mean, I feel quite honored actually having this conversation to be chatting with you, such a renowned poet. It's beautiful. It feels great for me. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, one of the things that Robert taught us too was just the importance of blessing and reminding us of our ability to bless others. So I try to practice that as much as I can in my own life now too, because I know how important it was to me.
Are you still teaching?
Yeah. Yeah. So, as a matter of fact, my classes since COVID started have been online, so anybody anywhere can take them. The last class I taught, I had someone who was taking it in Berlin. So,
that's nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to share the coordinates of all that with the group, but that's wonderful to know that you're still out there and actively teaching people like you. I believe are so needed in the world for this group of up and coming, aspiring young poets.
Yeah.
Well, Thomas, look, it's just been wonderful to chat with you. And as I said before we began recording, that I'm just so pleased that you're actually going to be joining our next Elder Wisdom Circle alongside Walton Stanley and Tim Young, such esteemed members of our community, and such they've been teaching now in our space for I think about 3 years now. And so to have you join them and to have you sharing your wisdom and your presence with our men is just going to be truly wonderful. So thank you.
Well, I'm really pleased that I was invited to join them, and I'm looking forward to this a lot. So thank you for your kindness.
Well, thank you for your time.